The ceremony had been running for 3 hours when the last name was called. Senna already knew. She had known since the second hour, when the Omega girls around her were chosen one by one, and the space beside her on the stone benches grew wider with each departure. She sat with her back straight and her hands flat against her thighs, and she did not look at the floor. The caller read her name with the same flat tone he used for everything else. She walked to the center of the hall. The torchlight was warm on her face. Around her, the remaining unmated alphas stood in a loose formation near the carved stone pillars. She made herself look at none of them directly. That was the rule. She had followed every rule her entire life. The silence stretched. It was not the silence of consideration. She knew the difference by now. This was the silence of men who had already decided and were simply waiting for the formality to end. One of them coughed. Another shifted his weight. The caller cleared his throat. No claim was made. She walked back to the benches. She sat. The girl beside her, already claimed, already carrying that particular brightness in her expression, shifted slightly to make room without looking at her. Helga was waiting at the edge of the hall when the ceremony closed. Her mother's face held no surprise, no disappointment either, which was somehow worse than both. Just a settled expression, the kind that meant a decision had been reached before the night began, and she was only waiting for the occasion to use it. "Come," Helga said. Senna followed her out. The cottage sat at the far edge of the Pax territory, small and drafty, hers for as long as Helga chose to allow it. She had lived there 4 years, since she turned 18, and Helga made clear that sharing a roof was not something either of them was required to endure past that point. The arrangement had suited them both. Distance was the only language they had ever spoken fluently. Helga did not come inside. She stood in the doorway with the cold pressing at her back and spoke in the same voice she used to give instructions to the pack house staff. "You have until morning." Senna turned from the hearth where she had just coaxed a flame into existence. "What?" "The pack cannot carry an unmated Omega indefinitely." Helga's eyes moved around the small room without settling on anything. "You have no wolf. You have no mate. There is no position here for you. It is the middle of winter. There are packs to the south. You are not without options. You cannot be serious." Helga looked at her then, fully, directly, in a way she rarely bothered. "You were given every opportunity this pack could offer. You were present at 5 ceremonies. Nothing has changed, and nothing will." Her voice did not rise. It never rose. "I have made my decision. Your decision. You have until morning," Helga said again, and pulled the door shut behind her. Senna stood in the small room with the fire she had just built and listened to her mother's footsteps cross the frozen ground and disappear. She did not move for a long moment. Then she went to the corner where her canvas bag sat folded on a shelf, and she began to pack. She did not take much. A coat, thick wool, one of the few useful things Helga had ever given her without prompting. A knife, her own, kept sharp out of habit. Dried provisions, a water skin, an extra pair of wool stockings she tucked into the bottom of the bag. She had learned young that traveling light was wiser than traveling prepared. Prepared assumed someone was there to help you prepare. She left before the hour turned. The forest north of Pack territory was not a road. It was not even a path. It was simply the direction that was not south, and south meant checkpoints, and checkpoints meant an unmated Omega with no papers being held and questioned and possibly sent back to the one place she had no intention of returning to. She chose north. The trees were old here, their canopy pressing down whatever light the clouds had not already swallowed. Snow on the ground muffled her footsteps to near nothing. She moved by touch more than sight, one hand occasionally finding bark to correct her bearing. The cold was manageable for the first hour. Uncomfortable, present, but manageable. By the second hour, it had moved past manageable. It found the gaps in her coat, pressed at the back of her neck, at her fingers through her gloves, at her cheeks where the wind came in sideways between the trunks. She kept moving. Movement was the only answer available. The snow came harder sometime around what she guessed was the third hour past midnight. Came sideways, driven on a wind that had been building for the past 30 minutes and now had nothing to prove. Visibility dropped to a few feet of white in every direction. Her legs had started reporting from a distance, still working, still moving, but the signal came slower now, as though something was being routed through the wrong channel. She stopped against a tree and made herself count to 30 before continuing. She reached 43. Her legs went at the knee first. She caught herself on both hands, palms plunging into snow past the wrist. Cold that had been external was suddenly everywhere. She pushed herself upright, took 4 more steps, and went down fully. She lay there, and her cheek was against the snow, and the wind above the tree line was loud. But down here, close to the ground, it was quieter. She thought distantly that this was a very poor place to stop. She did not get up. Caius heard his lead scout's signal before the man reached him. 3 short calls, low and controlled. Not danger. Something found. He raised a closed fist, and the column behind him slowed without a sound. 4 guards, Roderick at his left shoulder, horses exhaling white into the frozen dark. He had been running the northern border for 6 consecutive nights. The rogue attacks had started 3 weeks back. A shepherd post burned, a patrol gone missing near the ridge, a border marker destroyed with enough deliberate force that no one could call it weather damage. Too precise for wandering ferals. Someone was testing the boundary, pressing specific points, pulling back before a response could assemble. He had come to see the ground himself. The scout pushed through the tree line and reported low. "Person down, my lord. 50 yards east. No weapon. No wolf." Caius was off his horse before Roderick spoke. He found her at the base of a birch, half covered by the snow that had fallen since she stopped moving. Small frame, dark reddish hair gone wet against her forehead. A coat that was suitable for cold, but not for this cold. Her hands were bare in the snow. Her gloves had come off somewhere, or been removed, which made less sense. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. Pulse, slow, too slow, but present. His wolf went very still. Not the stillness of a threat being assessed. He knew that sensation, had lived in it for years on patrol. This was something else. Something that had no tactical name and sat lower in his chest than instinct usually did. He did not reach for an explanation. He filed it and moved. He turned her carefully onto her back. Her face was pale in the way that had nothing to do with cold weather and everything to do with too much of it. Lips beginning to shade wrong. A small scar across the left line of her chin, made more prominent by the cold pulling the skin tight. She was young. 20, perhaps a year or 2 past. Her eyes were closed. "Alive," he said to the scout behind him. "Get the bedroll from my pack." "My lord." Roderick's voice came quiet and deliberate. "We can send 2 men with her to the way station at the ridge crossing. Get the bedroll." Roderick did not argue a second time. They wrapped her in everything useful. Caius lifted her himself. His wolf settled the moment she was against his chest. A specific, immediate settling that he noted with the same part of his mind that noted everything on patrol, without interpretation, without reaction. He carried her back through the trees to where the horses stood and kept moving. The camp was a half-hour south, a stone shelter from an older patrol route, barely large enough for 6 men and a fire. He put her closest to the hearth, and Weston, who had field knowledge of cold injuries, examined her hands and said she had been fortunate. "Another hour out there," Weston said, "and we'd be having a different conversation." Caius nodded once and moved aside to let him work. She had no documents on her, no pack seal, no travel papers, nothing with a name. Her canvas bag held dried provisions, a water skin, a knife worn smooth at the handle from regular use, and a single extra pair of wool stockings. Someone had packed in a hurry and packed practically. He observed all of it and said nothing. Roderick appeared at his shoulder when the others had settled. "She has no wolf." It was not a question. Every shifter in the camp had registered the same absence. No. On foot, no papers, in the worst storm of the season. Roderick kept his voice low. "That is not a traveling accident." "No," Caius said again. "It isn't. You want to wait until she speaks. We'll know more when she does." Roderick was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. The rogue pattern tonight. Northern sector, 3rd Ridge. They pulled back the same way they always do, right before we'd have visual. I know. Whoever is running them knows our rotation. I know that too. Caius looked at the woman's face, the slow, visible rise of her breathing. We moved to the palace at dawn. I've seen what I came to see. Roderick turned to him. The remaining border stretch can wait 3 days. He kept his voice even. The attacks aren't random, and they won't become random by Thursday. Someone is building to something. I want walls around us when they decide to show what it is. He did not say the other part aloud, that he was not leaving her at a border way station with 2 guards and a question mark where her name should be. That his wolf had been unsettled for months, cold and functional and unsettled, and was not unsettled now, and he was not yet ready to examine what that meant. Roderick asked no further questions. He had worked beside Caius long enough to know the difference between a decision being made and a decision already reached. The camp went quiet. Caius sat with his back against the stone wall and did not sleep. The fire held steady. Outside, the storm had gentled to a moderate snowfall, the worst of the wind spent. Somewhere further along the northern ridge, a nightbird made a single sound and went silent. He thought about the rogue attacks, the precision of the withdrawal timing, the specific locations chosen, always on the boundary lines between his territory and 3 others, always at points that would, if enough pressure was applied in sequence, create a dispute about jurisdiction. Whoever was behind it understood pack law and wanted to use it. He thought about the girl. She had no wolf. He had felt that absence clearly when he first crouched beside her. Every shifter carried a secondary signature, the animal running under the human, and she had none of it. She was Omega by pack designation, which meant she was part of the shifter world, bound to pack law, expected to carry wolf blood even without the ability to shift. The absence of any wolf signature at all was unusual. Not impossible, but unusual. And yet something had made his wolf go still when he stepped into those trees. Not the absence of a threat, a presence. Something pressed low and quiet, and he searched for the word and discarded 3 before landing on the right one. Waiting. He set it aside. She would wake when she woke. She would speak, or she would not. He would know more then. Dawn broke gray and thin between the trees. The woman had not stirred. They broke camp in silence, packed in the practiced way of men who had done it too many times, and began the ride south toward the palace. Caius kept her wrapped in his own riding coat and positioned her across the saddle where the horse's body heat could do what it was built to do. The palace gates were 8 hours south. He did not ride slowly. She woke to the sound of someone moving quietly nearby, the specific careful quiet of a person trying not to disturb. The ceiling above her was stone, arched, higher than any ceiling she had slept under. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she had reason to expect. A fire burned to her left. The room smelled of dried herbs and candle wax and wood smoke, and somewhere outside the single narrow window, wind was moving through something, trees maybe, or the space between high walls. She sat up slowly. Her hands were wrapped in clean cloth. Her coat was gone, replaced by a heavy wool blanket pulled to her waist. Her boots stood by the fire, dried and placed with the kind of deliberate care that meant someone had thought about it, rather than simply dropping them. Don't rush. The voice came from the far side of the room. A woman, older, with white hair cut close to her head and a face that held the specific patience of someone who spent most of her time watching people be in worse condition than they realized. She was measuring something at a work table covered in small glass containers. "Where am I?" Senna asked. "The palace healing ward." The woman did not turn. "You've been unconscious for most of a day. Your temperature is still lower than I'd prefer. Don't rush." Senna looked at the door. Heavy wood, iron hinges. Closed but, she noticed, not barred. "Am I a prisoner?" The woman set down whatever she was measuring and turned. Her eyes were dark brown, unhurried. "You are a guest." For the moment, those 2 things look similar from the inside. The difference becomes clearer over time. She crossed to the bedside and held out a clay cup. "Drink this. It tastes poor and it matters." Senna took the cup, drank. It tasted of bark and something bitter underneath. "I'm Willa," the woman said. "I manage the healing work here. I'll need your name for the records." "Senna. And your pack?" A pause. "I don't have one." Willa looked at her for a moment without expression. Your full surname, for the record, Senna told her. Willa wrote it down in a leather-bound ledger without reaction, capped the ink, and moved back to her work table. The palace was larger than Senna had words for, not in the way of something designed to impress, though it did that incidentally, but in the way of something that had grown over a long time, adding to itself as need required, until the accumulation became its own kind of architecture. Corridors connected to other corridors. Stairwells appeared in unexpected places. The kitchens were underground and the grain stores were not, and the great hall could seat 300 and usually sat 50. She learned this over 4 days of being confined to the healing ward, mostly from Willa, partly from the 2 young servants who brought meals and answered questions with the careful brevity of people told not to overshare. On the 5th day, Willa told her she could move around, within the residential corridors and the lower hall, not the council chambers, not the east wing proper. She said it without looking up from her work. The service corridor beside it is still part of your usual route to the kitchens. Do not mistake one for the other. If anyone asks who you are, tell them you are assisting with the healing stores. That will be true enough. And if they ask by whose permission? Mine. Willa finally looked up. That will also be true enough. Senna thought about asking the larger question, why she was here, what was expected of her, what it meant that the Alpha King had carried her personally through a snowstorm and brought her into his walls without assigning her a function or a destination. She thought about it and did not ask. The question felt too large for a room this small. She would learn more by watching than by asking. And she had always been better at watching. She took the assignment and went to work. The work was real. The healing stores needed cataloging. Willa's system made sense to someone who had built it over 30 years and made very little sense to anyone else. Senna spent 3 full days learning the logic of it before she stopped reaching for the wrong shelf. Dried herbs organized not by name, but by use sequence. Tinctures grouped by the condition they treated, not the ingredient they contained. A separate locked cabinet for anything that required Willa's direct authorization, which turned out to be a broader category than expected. Why is gold thread locked? Senna asked on the 2nd day. Because it cures and kills within 3 drops of each other, Willa said. Most healers can manage that margin. Some can't. I prefer not to find out which category someone falls into after the fact. Senna filed that. On the 4th day of working in the stores, she was moving through the long corridor that connected the healing ward to the lower kitchen when she stopped. She had not heard anything. There was nothing to stop for. The corridor was empty, torchlit, exactly as it had been for the previous 40 seconds of walking. But she knew Willa was around the corner, not from a sound, not from a footstep or the rustle of fabric. Something else, something she had no name for. A certainty that arrived before any evidence did. The way you know a room is occupied before you open the door, except sharper, more specific. It was Willa. She knew the particular fact of it the way she knew the backs of her own hands. She stood there for a moment. Then Willa came around the corner carrying a tray, saw her standing in the corridor, and said, "Good. I was about to send someone to find you." Senna said nothing about what had just happened. She took the other side of the tray, and they walked back together. She saw the Alpha King for the first time on the 6th day. Not to speak to. From a distance, a gallery above the lower hall, where she had been sent to retrieve a specific measuring tool Willa claimed to have left there. The hall below was active with what looked like an arbitration of some kind. 2 men arguing their case to a council of 4, and Caius seated at the center of the long table. She had constructed an image of him from the fragmented dark of the night she barely remembered and the things Helga's household had said about the king for as long as she could recall. That image was useful and almost entirely wrong. He was younger than she had expected. Not young. There was nothing of youth in the way he held a room, in the specific quality of attention he gave to the men speaking, in the way the council deferred to him without theater because the deference was simply accurate to the actual weight in the room. But younger than the figure she had assembled from years of second-hand contempt. He was not performing authority. He had it. She stayed longer than the task required. One of the men below raised his voice. His hands came up in a gesture that crossed the boundary between emphasis and threat. The hall did not react. Caius did not react in any visible way. He simply looked at the man, and the man's hands came down, and the voice came down with them, and whatever point was being made was made at a lower temperature than it had started. Senna picked up Willa's measuring tool and left. She did not know what to do with what she had seen. The figure Helga's household had described, cold, self-serving, a king who used pack law as a personal instrument, was not what sat at that table. She understood that performance existed. She had grown up watching Helga perform warmth for pack elders, and she knew exactly what it looked like. This was not that. This was something she had no category for yet. She gave it space. She kept working. She watched. Roderick found Caius after evening council. He waited until the last of the advisors had cleared the corridor before he fell into step beside the Alpha King and kept his voice below the ambient noise of the palace settling into night. "The surname," he said. "Senna's." Caius kept walking. "You found something." "I knew it from somewhere. Took me 3 days to place it." Roderick drew a folded piece of paper from his inside coat. "There are records in the palace archive from your father's time. A pact to the north put forward a formal proposal for political alliance, a bonding contract, pack merger terms, the usual mechanism. Your father declined. Strategically sound decision, nothing personal in the correspondence." Caius took the paper, read it, read it a second time. "The woman who made the proposal. Aurea," Roderick said. "Same surname as the girl in your healing ward." A pause. "The pack that cast her out in a snowstorm," Caius said, not as a question. "Her mother's pack, yes." Caius folded the paper. He stood in the corridor for a moment with the sound of the palace around him and nothing on his face that gave anything away. "She doesn't know," he said. "I'd say almost certainly not. The way she talks about that household, what I've gathered from Willa, she was raised in it, not educated by it. Someone decided what she needed to know and made that decision badly. Does Willa know what you found?" "Not yet." Caius was quiet. His jaw moved slightly. A habit Roderick had learned years ago meant he was working through the geometry of something, mapping out which move created which consequence. "Leave it for now," Caius said finally. "I want to understand what she knows before I hand her something that will change every piece of it. If she's been told a version of that history, I want to know which version. And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, she is working with Willa and causing no trouble." He handed the paper back. "Archive that properly, not with the general records." Roderick took it. "The rogue pattern last night, Eastern Ridge, second crossing." "I know. It's still moving. It will keep moving." Caius turned toward his own quarters. "Find out who has been moving through that territory on merchant licenses in the past 2 months. Someone is supplying information about our rotation timing, and it isn't coming from inside this building." Roderick nodded and went the other direction. She was 3 weeks into the palace rhythm when the letter arrived. It came through official pack courier, which meant it had been routed through the regional dispatch system and stamped and logged and delivered with the same indifferent efficiency as a tax record or a boundary dispute notification. It bore the seal of Helga's pack. It was addressed to Senna by full name, care of the palace receiving office, which meant someone at Helga's end had known where she was and had made no other inquiry in the weeks since. Willa brought it to her without comment. Senna opened it at the work table in the healing stores, surrounded by the smell of dried bark and the quiet sound of Willa working on the other side of the room. It was short, formally structured. The Pack Record Bureau used a specific language for this kind of document, and whoever had drafted it had used that language without deviation. It stated that the formal bond between Senna of the Pack and the Pack Collective was dissolved, effective the date of dispatch. It cited the relevant provision of Pack law that governed such dissolutions, voluntary departure under census period, which was not precisely what had happened, but was the provision that created the least administrative complexity. It bore Helga's signature at the bottom, written with the same steady hand she used for everything. There was no personal note, no additional page, no postscript. Senna read it twice, set it on the work table, looked at the far wall. She had known, in the part of her that tracked practical realities, that this was the likely conclusion. That Helga would want the matter clean. That clean, to Helga, meant documented and closed, with no thread left for someone to pull on later. The letter was perfectly consistent with everything she knew about her mother, and nothing in it was a surprise. And yet, she sat with the paper in front of her and the fire to her left, and Willa moving quietly on the other side of the room, and she felt nothing she could name cleanly. Not grief, or not grief exactly. More the sensation of a door closing in a room she had already left, except that she had not quite realized until this moment that some part of her had been listening for it to open again. That part was done listening. She folded the letter, put it inside the ledger cover where she kept her few personal documents, returned to the herb she had been sorting before Willa brought the envelope. Willa said nothing. Senna did not want her to. She worked until the stores were in order, and the candles had burned a full inch, and the palace outside had gone quiet with the particular quiet of a building past midnight. Then she cleaned her work surface and went to her room and lay in the dark with her hands flat on her sternum and the ceiling above her very still and high. The window showed a narrow strip of sky. The clouds had cleared sometime in the past hour, and a few stars were visible, cold and remote and utterly indifferent. She thought about Helga's handwriting. Steady even. Exactly the same as it always was. Nothing in it had trembled. Nothing in it suggested the pen had paused. She turned onto her side. She did not sleep for a long time, but she did not cry, and she was not sure, lying there in the dark, which of those two facts told her more about who she had become. 3 weeks had passed since the letter. Senna had stopped counting the days somewhere around the second week, when the rhythm of the palace had become familiar enough that time stopped announcing itself. She rose before the healing ward needed her. She worked alongside Willa until the stores were in order. She ate in the small room off the kitchen where the lower staff took their meals, and she listened to the conversations around her without contributing much and learned more than anyone realized she was learning. She was good at that. She had been learning how to survive by listening longer than anyone expected. The work had given her something she had not expected to want, a reason to be in a room that had nothing to do with anyone's permission. Willa had begun asking her opinion on things, quietly, without ceremony, in the manner of someone who had decided the opinion was worth asking for and saw no need to announce that decision. Which herbs had replenished? Whether the apprentice from the lower kitchens was ready to be trusted with the fever tinctures. Whether a particular patient in the second ward was improving or merely less visibly unwell. Senna answered each question as precisely as she could. She was usually right. She noticed that too, and filed it away with the corridor incident from 2 weeks back. The certainty that had arrived before the evidence, the specific knowledge of Willa's presence before any sound gave her reason to know it. There had been 3 more moments like it since. Small, easy to rationalize, not quite possible to dismiss. She did not know what they meant. She kept working. The summons came on a gray morning when the clouds sat low against the peaks and the courtyard outside smelled of coming snow. Willa found her in the stores and spoke without preamble. "Pack your kit. We leave within the hour." "Where?" "A village at the northern border. 3 days' ride." She was already moving, pulling specific things from specific shelves with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Fever sickness started 2 weeks ago. 2 dead, more symptomatic. The village falls under the king's direct territory, and the rogues have been active enough in that stretch that the regional healer won't travel without an escort. She handed Senna a bundle of wrapped cloth. "Which means we travel with the king's escort." Senna took the bundle. "Is that a problem?" Willa asked, reading something in her expression. "No," Senna said. She went to pack. The riding party was 10, Caius and Roderick at the front, 6 guards in formation, Willa and Senna at the center of the column, where the horses' combined body heat created a corridor of relative warmth. The road north was stone-paved for the first hour and became hard-packed dirt after the second bridge, and the cold that had been manageable in the palace courtyard found new ambitions in the open country. The first day passed in near silence. The second opened differently. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a stream that ran clear despite the cold. Senna climbed down from the saddle and went to refill the water skins. When she turned back, Caius was beside her. Not by design, or not obviously by design. He was checking the front horse's left foreleg, which had been favoring slightly since morning, and the stream bank was simply where that work happened. but the space between them was closer than it had been in the 3 weeks she had moved through his palace, and neither of them treated that closeness as accidental once it was there. "How is the work with Willa?" he asked. She looked at him. He was watching the horse's leg, pressing carefully along the cannon bone. "It's useful," she said. "She tells me you have an instinct for it." "She told you that?" "Willa tells me most things." He moved his hand up to the knee joint. "She says you have a specific aptitude for assessment, that you see what's wrong before the examination confirms it." Senna was quiet for a moment. The stream ran over stones behind her. "It started recently," she said. "The past few weeks. I'm not sure what it is." He was still focused on the horse's leg, but something shifted in his posture. A stillness, different from his ordinary stillness. "It will develop," he said. "If you let it." "You say that, as if you know what it is." "I have a theory." He straightened and looked at her for the first time since he had come to stand beside her. The amber in his eyes was very direct in the flat winter light. "I could be wrong." She waited. "You've been under significant strain for a long time," he said. "That kind of pressure can suppress things. When it lifts—" He stopped. "As I said, a theory." He moved back toward the front of the column. Senna stood at the stream bank and turned that over in her mind for a long time before she remounted. The village was smaller than she had expected, and harder than she had expected. The sick were in the communal hall, 8 of them, ranging in age from a child of perhaps 6 to a man well past 60. The 2 deaths had been at the extremes of that range. The remaining 8 were in varying stages of the same progression. High fever, difficulty breathing, the particular stillness of people conserving every available resource for the work of staying alive. Willa assessed the room in 3 minutes and began directing. Senna followed instructions and then began anticipating them, moving to the next task before Willa called for it, and Willa noticed but said nothing beyond a brief glance that contained its own acknowledgement. The child was the most critical. 6 years old, red-haired, too still in a way that the other sick were not. Senna sat beside her for an hour while the tinctures worked and watched her breathing and counted the intervals. The child's mother sat on the other side, not speaking, her hands gripped around each other. Senna stayed there longer than Willa strictly needed her to stay, because once she had given the woman that assurance, she could not simply vanish from the room as if the promise had belonged only to the moment it was spoken. "She's fighting," Senna said. The woman looked at her. "The interval between breaths is lengthening. That means the fever is breaking, not winning." Senna kept her voice level. "She's fighting." The woman looked back at her daughter, and her grip on her own hands loosened by a fraction. Senna stayed through the afternoon. They made camp at the village edge that night. The guards arranged a perimeter with the quick efficiency of men who ran border patrols regularly, and the fire was built in a stone ring that had clearly been used for the same purpose before. Caius was reviewing something with Roderick on the far side of the fire when the sound at the tree line stopped Senna cold. She was crossing from the supply cart to the fire, and she simply stopped walking. Nothing. No sound. That was the problem. The birds that had been active in the canopy for the past hour had gone silent all at once, and the texture of that silence was wrong. "My lord," she said. Caius looked up. "Something in the trees." She did not know how she knew. She knew. East side. 50 yards, maybe more. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. His hand came up, and 3 guards moved without sound to the eastern perimeter. Roderick's hand went to his blade. 15 seconds of nothing. Then the trees gave up a shape. A young man, perhaps 16, scrambling through the underbrush with the panicked incompetence of someone who had not intended to be found. He came out of the tree line with both hands raised, shaking, and identified himself as a villager's son who had been checking a snare line and lost track of the time. Roderick interrogated him briefly and released him back toward the village. The guards stood down. Caius said nothing for a moment. Then he looked across the fire at Senna with an expression she could not entirely read. "How did you know?" Roderick asked. "The birds," she said. Roderick glanced up at the canopy. "I didn't hear anything." "No," Senna said. "That was the point." Roderick looked at Caius. Caius looked at Senna for another second, and then turned back to the map he had been reviewing, and whatever passed between them in that second went unspoken and was somehow complete anyway. They were back at the palace in 2 days. The sick child was improving when they left. Willa had left a full supply of the tincture with written instructions, and the regional healer had arrived that morning, mollified by the escort, and had taken over the case with professional competence. Senna had watched him work and catalogued what he did differently from Willa, and asked one question that he answered in more detail than she had anticipated, which told her he had been waiting for someone to ask. The ride back was faster. The road was familiar now, and the horses moved with more purpose than they had on the way out. On the second day, somewhere between the second bridge and the palace gates, Caius rode back through the column and settled his horse alongside hers for a quarter of an hour without particular reason. They talked about the sick child, and then about the fever pattern in the village, and then, at some point, about something neither of them had initiated. She mentioned that she had taught herself basic wound care from a borrowed book at 15, the only medical text in Helga's household, a practical manual with half its pages water-damaged. And he told her that Willa had refused to accept the first healer the palace sent and had trained her own replacement, which had initially been considered insubordination and had eventually been recognized as foresight. Neither of them said anything meaningful. That was not the point. The point was the ease of it, the absence of the particular guardedness she had carried into every conversation in that palace for 3 weeks, and the absence of whatever distance he maintained in formal settings and the road running south between the trees with the cold sitting quietly above the canopy. She noticed the ease. She put it away. Willa found her the day after they returned. It was late afternoon, and Senna had been back in the stores for 6 hours, running through the inventory with the systematic attention the time away had made necessary. Willa came in with her coat still on, which was unusual, and said, "Come with me." She led Senna through 3 corridors she had not used before, down a stairwell that appeared behind a door she had assumed was a storage closet, and into a section of the palace that smelled of old paper and lantern oil and the specific dry cold of a room that was kept at a stable temperature regardless of season. The archive. It was not large. Metal shelving, floor to ceiling, densely packed with ledgers and folded documents and bound correspondence organized by reign and year and category. A work table in the center, 2 lanterns already lit. "I have access here as senior healing staff," Willa said. "The records from the healing stores go back 200 years. You'll need to understand the historical context for some of the older remedies." She moved to a specific shelf, found a ledger, placed it on the table. Especially the fever treatments. The current methods were adapted from older protocols around the time of the previous king's reign. Senna sat at the table and opened the ledger. The fever protocols were there, detailed, clearly organized, exactly what Willa had promised. She read for an hour while Willa worked at the other end of the table, cross-referencing something in a separate volume. She reached the section on regional fever strains and found it cross-referenced to a separate bound file of correspondence. The notation said it related to a Northern Pact's documented outbreak 30 years prior, treated under the previous king's territorial authority. She pulled the correspondence file. The fever documentation was there, thorough and useful. Beneath it, attached by a length of faded ribbon, was a second bundle. Not medical, political. A formal proposal of alliance, the pact name at the top, the terms laid out in the careful language of official negotiation. She read the pack name twice. Her pack. Her mother's pack. The territory she had walked out of in a snowstorm with a canvas bag and a knife. She kept reading. The previous king's response was attached. Polite, formal, citing strategic priorities and the particular demands of the current political alignment. A declination, but not a dismissal. The tone was measured, the language respectful, the refusal grounded in logistics rather than judgment. Then the second letter from the pack. The tone had changed. Then a third. She was 4 letters deep when Willa said quietly, "The light is going." Senna looked up. The lanterns had burned lower than she had realized. "Take what you need," Willa said. She was not looking at Senna. She was closing her own volumes with the careful deliberateness of someone giving another person a moment to think. "The correspondence bundle belongs to the archive, but you may bring it back tomorrow if you find it relevant to your studies." Senna looked at the bundle in her hands. Then, at Willa. Willa picked up her coat and walked to the stairwell door and waited without pressure. Senna tucked the bundle under her arm and followed. In the courtyard outside the archive entrance, Roderick was moving with the focused urgency that meant information and not crisis, different from his patrol-bearing, more contained. He went directly to the guards' corridor without stopping. Later, Senna would learn that a delegation had arrived at the palace gates that afternoon. A formal diplomatic party from the Eastern Territories, 7 riders, requesting overnight lodging under the guest rights provisions of pack law. Their lord was named Draven. She did not know that name yet. She went to her room with the correspondence bundle and the lantern from her bedside table, and she sat on the floor with her back against the bed, and she began to read. She read through the night. The lantern burned to its base, and she replaced it with the spare from the shelf above her bed and kept reading. The correspondence bundle was 11 letters total. 6 from Oria, 5 from the previous king's administrative office. She read them in order once, then went back to the beginning and read them again more slowly. The first letter from Oria was formal and measured. A pack leader presenting terms. The proposal was for a bonding alliance. Oria's eldest daughter to be matched with a son of the royal house when of age, the pack's northern territory folded under the crown's protection in exchange. The terms were reasonable, not unusual for the period. The kind of arrangement that happened regularly in the years when the northern borders were less stable. The king's first response declined. Not harshly, in the specific careful language of a refusal that wanted to leave the door open for other forms of negotiation. It cited existing treaty obligations that made a formal bonding contract complicated and offered an alternative, a trade agreement, territorial recognition, no bonding clause required. Oria's second letter had a different temperature. Not hostile yet, but reading it against the first, the change was unmistakable. The request had been interpreted as rejection, the alternative offer as insult. The language of the letter reached for dignity and landed somewhere closer to wounded. She wrote of her family's standing, of what had been offered and what had been refused, of what it meant for a woman in her position to have extended a formal proposal and received a trade contract in return. The third letter dropped the pretense entirely. She read it twice. Oria had decided, somewhere between the second letter and the third, that the refusal had been personal, that the king had looked at her family, at her, and found them insufficient. The letter said this plainly, in words that had the particular force of something a person had told themselves many times before committing it to paper. It talked about what the crown owed families who held the northern borders, about respect, about what it meant to be dismissed. The king's third response was brief and final. It acknowledged receipt of the correspondence and noted that the matter was considered closed. There were 3 more letters from Oria. None of them were answered. Senna sat on the floor with the last letter in her hands and looked at the far wall. She had been 4 years old when Oria died. She had no real memory of her, only a carved impression from the things that had been said afterward, always in the tone reserved for founding figures, for people whose decisions had shaped the shape of everything that came after. Oria had been proud. Oria had been wronged. The king's family had looked at their pack and found them wanting, and everything they had suffered since could be traced to that root. She had grown up watered by that story. The letters in her hands were 11 pieces of paper. They showed a woman who had proposed an alliance and been refused on practical grounds and had decided, over the course of 3 unanswered letters, that the refusal meant something it had not meant. Who had built an architecture of injury from a door closing for reasons that had nothing to do with her? Who had passed that architecture to her daughter as doctrine and to her daughter's daughter as though it were inheritance? Helga had not invented any of it. She had simply accepted it whole and aimed it downward at the one person in reach. Senna set the last letter down. She was not sad. She had expected sad, or something adjacent to it, the same hollow anesthesia that the letter from Helga had produced. This was not that. This was anger, clean, sharp, the kind that comes not from being wronged, but from understanding the full dimensions of a thing you had already partly understood. She had known, somewhere beneath the official story, that the hatred she had absorbed about this palace and this king and this family had always felt larger than its stated cause. She had felt her entire life the exhaustion of carrying a grievance that did not belong to her. Now she knew why. She had been expelled into a winter storm, alone, over a slight that had not happened the way she was told, over a letter a dead woman had misread decades before Senna was born. She put the correspondence back in order, tied the ribbon, and set the bundle on the shelf. Then she lay down on the bed without removing her boots and stared at the ceiling until morning came. She did not go to the healing stores. She went to the Great Hall instead, which was not her territory and which she had no assigned reason to enter. She stood at the side entrance and watched the morning council assemble. 6 advisors, Roderick standing to the right of the long table, Caius at the center. And at the far end, newly seated, a man she did not recognize. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, older than Caius by several years, with the particular ease of someone who had never once been uncertain of his welcome in a room. He was watching the council proceedings with polite attention and a very slight smile that suggested the attention was not genuine. He caught her looking. She moved back into the corridor. Willa told her his name that afternoon without being asked, in the manner of someone who had decided the information was relevant to Senna's well-being. Draven, Willa said, not looking up from the shelf she was reorganizing. Alpha of the Eastern Territories. He has come twice before in the past 4 years. Both times under diplomatic grounds. Both times Roderick has found reasons to shorten the visit. What does he want? He always says trade routes. Willa moved a glass container to a different shelf. Roderick believes he wants a seat on the Northern Border Council. The king does not intend to give him one. Senna processed this. He looked at me, she said. Willa turned. Her expression was not alarmed, but it was not unconcerned either. Where? The hall, this morning. Willa was quiet for a moment. Stay in the familiar corridors. Do not go into the East Wing itself without me or Roderick knowing. The service corridor beside the annex is still acceptable, but keep moving and do not stop there if you can avoid it. She was in the East corridor that connected the healing ward to the lower hall, familiar ground, her regular route, when Draven appeared. Not from ahead, from a doorway to the left that she had always passed without attention, a narrow service entrance that connected to the council annex. He came through it and stopped, and the specific quality of the stop told her it was not accidental. You're the girl the king brought in from the snow. His voice was conversational, curious, almost friendly. I heard the story. Remarkable thing being carried personally. He doesn't usually do that. Senna did not stop walking. He doesn't usually do much that's personal, Draven continued, falling into step beside her with the ease of a man who assumed the direction of motion was his to decide. Which makes you interesting. What is it about you specifically? I don't know, she said. I don't think about it. You should. He was not touching her, not blocking her path, maintaining just enough appropriate distance that nothing about the encounter was technically wrong. A woman with no pack, no formal status, no documentation, you're in a difficult position. Positions like that tend to shift depending on the interest of whoever's keeping you comfortable. She kept her pace. I only mean, he said, voice still easy, that if the king's interest changes, your situation changes. It would be useful to have other options, other alliances. I'm not looking for an alliance. No one is, until they need one. He stopped walking. She did not. Think about it, he said behind her. I'll be here 4 more days. She rounded the corner and kept moving until she reached the healing ward and closed the door. She went to Caius that evening, not through Roderick, not through Willa. She went to the study where he received matters that didn't require the full council chamber, knocked twice, and waited. Come in. He was at the desk, reviewing a map she recognized as the Northern Border region. He looked up. She came to the center of the room and stood with her hands at her sides and said, I read the archive correspondence, Oria's letters to your father. A pause. Nothing moved in his expression. I know Roderick found my surname, she said, and I know you knew before you decided not to say anything. I want to know why. He set down the map notation he had been holding. Sit down, he said. I'd prefer to stand. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put both forearms on the desk and spoke directly. Roderick identified the surname the week you arrived. He found the archive records and brought them to me. At that point, I knew your grandmother had a history with this palace, and that whatever version of that history you had been given had likely shaped everything you thought about this place. He paused. I chose to wait, not because I was concealing it, because I wanted to understand what you knew before I handed you a correction that would change the frame on your entire life. That wasn't your decision to make. No, he said. It wasn't. She looked at him. The admission sat in the room without qualification or follow-up. Willa took me to the archive, she said. I know. She told me she intended to. You let her. It was not mine to block. He held her gaze. I was wrong to wait as long as I did. I could tell you the reason was protecting you from an incomplete picture, and that would be partly true. The other part is that I was not sure how you would respond, and I preferred to understand you better before the conversation happened. That was about my calculation, not your readiness. She stood with that for a moment. Aurea misread the letters, she said. My father's refusal was strategic. I've read the correspondence since Roderick brought it to me. There was nothing personal in it. She built an entire story. Yes. And it survived her. For decades. He said nothing. There was nothing to add. She breathed in, out. Draven approached me in the corridor today. The quality of Caius's stillness changed. He suggested I should consider other alliances in case your interest shifted. She kept her voice level. He was careful not to make it a threat. It wasn't quite one. Caius stood. He did not raise his voice. Where? East Corridor. The service entrance from the council annex. He crossed to the door and opened it. Roderick was in the hall, apparently on his way past for unrelated reasons. He wasn't. She had begun to understand that Roderick was rarely anywhere accidentally. Caius spoke low, and Roderick's expression shifted in the way she had come to recognize as the one that meant he already had the shape of it and was now only getting the specifics. He left down the corridor at once. Caius came back into the study. He will move Draven's men to the guest side of the palace and put guards on the annex doors, he said. No one from that party should be alone in our interior corridors again. Should? She asked. The palace was not built in 1 century, he said. It has more connecting passages than I like and more servant routes than I can close in a minute. His voice remained level. But Roderick will close what matters first. That answer irritated her less than reassurance would have. It was practical. It was also honest. It happened an hour later anyway. By then, the visible guard pattern had changed. 2 palace guards had been posted at the main annex doors, and the guest party had been confined to the eastern rooms under formal hospitality restrictions. Senna knew that because she had seen the shift herself on her way down to the kitchens. What she had not seen, what Roderick apparently had not had time to seal yet, was the narrow service cut used by the older household staff between the annex storage rooms and the lower passage. She was in the east corridor again, returning from the kitchens with the evening supply cart because one of the kitchen runners had been diverted to the guard floor and the route was still, technically, within the corridor Willa had permitted, when she heard the door behind her and recognized the presence before she turned. Draven was not alone. 2 men from his party flanked him, large and deliberately positioned, and the corridor's single torch threw the whole arrangement into the kind of shadow men like that preferred. I expected you might go straight to him, Draven said. The friendly tone from earlier was gone. Something more efficient had replaced it. I hope to have until morning. I'll work with what I have. She looked at the cart between them. At the door at the end of the corridor, which was 40 feet and 2 large men away. You understand that Caius isn't here, she said. That's the point. He stepped forward. You're going to come with me quietly. You're going to be in my party's rooms, completely unharmed, completely comfortable, and in the morning, I'm going to have a very different conversation with the king about the Northern Border Council. He spread his hands. This is politics. It's not personal. She backed up 1 step. Something happened. She could not describe it then, or for a long time after. It started in her spine, a vibration that had nothing to do with fear. Below fear, older than it, a sound more than a feeling. Her vision sharpened. The shadows in the corridor became specific. She could hear Draven's heartbeat, fast and controlled. She could hear the breathing of the two men behind him, the weight of one of them shifting to his front foot before he committed. Draven reached for her. Her body moved without her. Not a step back, not to the side. Something tore through her from the inside out, white hot, the bones in her right hand and forearm splintering and reforming in the span of a half-breath, and she hit the wall with her changed hand, and the stone cracked beneath it, and the sound that came out of her throat was not human and did not try to be. Draven stopped. His two men had gone back against the opposite wall. The cart lay on its side between them, spilled across the stone floor, and she had not touched it. The vibration had. She stood against the wall with her right arm shaking, the shift incomplete, bones half reformed. Her vision doubled between two different ways of seeing. Her legs went. She hit the floor on her knees. She was aware of the end of the corridor opening. Boots, fast. More than two people. Draven's voice said something sharp. His men were already moving. She heard them go. Then a hand on her face. Not grabbing. Just present. Palm against her jaw, steadying the trembling that had taken over her whole right side. "Stay with me," Caius said. She focused on his voice. The doubled vision collapsed back to one. Her arm was hers again, whole, the bones settled, the burning fading to a deep ache. "Roderick," she started, "is handling it." His other hand came to her shoulder. "Look at me." She did. His face was close. The amber eyes direct, no performance in them, no calculation. Just him, fully present, the way she had seen him be with the men who brought him problems in the courtyard. All of his attention in one place. "Your arm," he said. "It's mine again." He looked at her right arm. She followed his gaze. The sleeve was intact. The skin beneath it was faintly reddened, the way skin looks after too much cold or too much heat, but nothing was broken. "That was the first time," he said. It was not a question, but she answered it. "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. His hand was still at her jaw, and neither of them moved to change that. "Can you stand?" She thought about it honestly. "Not immediately." "Then don't." He sat down on the floor of the corridor, back against the wall, and stayed beside her while the trembling worked its way through her and spent itself. And the palace moved around them with the regular sounds of guards and corridors, and night beginning to settle. And neither of them spoke again for a long time. She slept for most of the following day. Willa had examined her arm at first light and delivered her assessment without softening it. What Senna's body had attempted the previous night was the equivalent of years of suppressed function releasing all at once. The wolf was real, had always been real, had been working against a pressure that was simply gone now. Rest, food, time, in that order, non-negotiable. Senna did not argue. She lay in the room off the healing ward and looked at the ceiling and ran the previous night through her mind with the same methodical patience she applied to everything she needed to understand. The shift had not felt like something new arriving. That was the detail she kept returning to. It had felt like something already present, finally being allowed to move. The wolf, on the other side of whatever door had held it back, was not a stranger. It was older than her, more patient than her, and had apparently spent years waiting with a composure she had not managed herself. She flexed her right hand. Normal. No ache, no residual heat. Willa came in mid-morning with tea and the organized expression she wore when she had already sorted the information she was about to deliver. "Roderick confirmed it this morning," she said, setting the tray down. The rogue attacks. The patrol rotation knowledge, the withdrawal timing, it came from Draven's merchant licenses. 2 years of licensed passage through the northern border gave his people enough geographic access to map the schedule precisely. He was directing them, Senna said. Paid contractors, not ferals, pressed at specific boundary points to create jurisdictional friction. The end goal was a seat on the Northern Border Council, positioned as the neutral mediating authority once the friction became formal dispute. Willa poured the tea. Without Caius's agreement, which he would never have given voluntarily. What happens now? Caius goes to the Northern Crossing directly, dissolves the arrangement without Draven present to manage the narrative. Without financing, the rogues disperse. Willa sat. He leaves at dawn. Senna looked up. "Your presence at that crossing," Willa said, "is not a military matter. I think you know what it is. She found Roderick in the guard corridor that afternoon. He stopped, assessed her with rapid efficiency, and concluded she was functional. I want to come tomorrow, she said. I know. He resumed walking. She matched his pace. Caius made the same call this morning. You ride with the main party. What's waiting at the crossing? Draven left before noon. He'll have riders there ahead of us. Not enough for a direct confrontation. Enough to make a public record of his argument before the elder witnesses. He'll claim the rogue activity was within his legal rights as a neighboring alpha. He'll say it loudly for the record, regardless of outcome. And when the legal argument doesn't hold, Senna said, he'll find whatever he thinks is the weakest point. Roderick glanced at her sideways. Yes. She thought about the corridor, the two men, the door, 40 feet away. He'll try to use me again, she said. He already tried that once. Roderick stopped in front of the guard room and turned to face her. Here is what I'll say once and not repeat. You stood in that corridor last night with two trained men between you and the door, and you did not break. Tomorrow, remember that you already know what you do under pressure. He went inside. Senna stood in the corridor for a moment, then went to pack. They left at dawn. Full company, 12 guards, Roderick, Willa, and Caius at the front, with the bearing he carried when a situation had real weight behind it. Not different from his usual presence, just more concentrated, the way a fire is more itself in cold air. The road north was familiar now. The stone paving that gave out after the second bridge. The old forest pressing close before the border territory opened. She had ridden part of it once already, and it felt shorter this time, the landmarks arriving before she expected them. The crossing itself lay on a faster cut of the northern road than the Fever Village, closer to the palace and better maintained for patrol traffic. They reached the northern crossing by midday. Draven was already there with 8 riders, arranged at the near side of the crossing marker, with the particular positioning of men who wanted to appear settled without appearing aggressive. The elder witnesses stood to the side, 4 of them, senior rank, carrying record ledgers and the careful neutrality of people present to observe rather than intervene. Caius brought his horse to the crossing marker and stopped. My Lord King. Draven's voice carried without effort in the cold, open air. I had hoped this might be resolved without requiring a full escort. The border matter is resolved, Caius said. Your merchant licenses have been suspended pending council review. The patrol rotation has been restructured. The rogue contractors dispersed when the payment source was identified and closed. Strong accusations. Documented ones. Roderick opened the correspondence case across his saddle. Payment records correlating to the attack timeline. Contractor correspondence under your administrative seal. Supply routes traceable to... My office handles considerable correspondence, Draven said. I cannot personally verify every transaction. That argument will be available to you at the Winter Border Council session, Caius said. You are welcome to present it there. Draven looked at the elder witnesses. They were listening without expression. Then he looked at Senna. She had known this was coming since the party cleared the tree line. Had watched him catalog them. Caius, Roderick, then her, and the pause on her. I'm curious about something, he said, and the conversational ease was back, designed to carry to the witnesses. The woman the king brought in from a snowstorm with no papers and no pack. What is her formal status here? Because from where I stand, it looks like a private arrangement using official ceremony as cover. The elder witnesses were still listening. Senna moved her horse forward. Not far. Enough to be clearly seen. She stopped at Caius's right shoulder. Not behind the party, not at the margins of it. Beside him. She looked at Draven and held it without looking for anything to say. 3 seconds. 5. Draven's ease held, then held less easily. Whatever he was reading in her stillness was not giving him what he needed. No uncertainty to present to the witnesses. No visible instability. Nothing to work with. She was simply there, present and deliberate, in the place she had chosen to be. Caius spoke then, and his voice had the particular quality of something being said for the record. Her formal status will be registered with the council office this week, he said. Her name is Senna. She has been working in the palace healing ward under senior certification, and she rode with this party because she is part of this household. Any further questions about her standing can be directed to me directly. He said it without turning toward her. He did not need to. The fact of her at his shoulder said everything the words did not. One of the elder witnesses made a notation in his ledger. Draven looked between them. The calculation behind his eyes ran its course and arrived at its conclusion. "The winter session," he said. "Winter session," Caius confirmed. Draven turned his horse, and his riders turned with him, and they rode east along the boundary line until the forest took them, and the space they had occupied became cold, empty air again. The elder witness who had been writing stepped forward and spoke to Roderick briefly. Roderick answered. The witness nodded, made a second notation, and returned to his position. Willa brought her horse alongside Senna's. She said nothing. Her expression said enough. They arrived back at the palace as the afternoon light was going copper and low over the western walls. The horses were taken to the yard. The guards dispersed. Roderick went directly to the records office with the documentation case and the senior witness notation. Willa disappeared into the healing ward with her kit and the particular purposefulness of someone who had been away from her work longer than she preferred. The courtyard emptied. Senna stood at the edge of it with her riding gloves in one hand and the cold settling back around her now that the movement had stopped. She heard him behind her. Caius came to stand beside her at the courtyard's edge. Not close enough to crowd, not far enough to be formal. He looked out at the same stretch of stone and fading light she was looking at. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no task in front of them. No crisis, no movement, no negotiation requiring resolution. For the first time in the weeks she had been inside these walls, there was simply the evening and the two of them standing in it without anything pressing them forward. The witness notation, she said. What he wrote down. It will stand as part of the crossing record. Draven cannot dispute it at the council session without disputing the witness's account directly. She nodded slowly. Part of this household. It was accurate. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. Had been, she thought, for longer than the moment she turned. The mate bond had been present for weeks. She understood that now, with the same clarity, she understood her own heartbeat. It had been there in the streambank conversation, in the floor of the border camp corridor, in the corridor outside the healing ward after the shift. She had been calling it something else. Awareness, attention, the particular quality of a room when he was in it. She had been precise about everything in her life, except this. You knew, she said, what I was to you. Before you knew my name. My wolf knew, he said. I was slower. How long did it take you to catch up? Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. The thing underneath where a smile comes from. The moment you told Roderick the birds had gone quiet, he said. Not because you were right, because of how you said it. She thought about that night. The firelight, Roderick's upward glance at the canopy, her answer. Because that was the point. I've been angry for a long time, she said. It came out simply, without needing to be larger than it was. At Helga. At Oria's story. At all of it. I walked out of that forest and into your walls still carrying most of it. I know. I'm not carrying it the same way anymore. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. The amber of his eyes was steady in the low copper light, and there was nothing in his face that was managing the moment or calculating its outcome. He was simply there, the way he had been simply there on the floor of the corridor while she stopped shaking, while she put herself back together, one breath at a time. She had not been looked at like that before, as though the looking itself was the point. The records office, she said. When Roderick files in the morning, whatever you want the record to say. Something true, she said. What's true is that I'm not leaving. He did not move toward her. He did not need to. Something settled between them in the space where distance had been. Not closed, not rushed, but different from what it had been that morning, and both of them knew exactly what it was. Then the record will say that, he said. She went to the archive the following morning. The door behind the storage stairwell, the lantern oil and old paper smell, the shelving running floor to ceiling, the correspondence bundle where she had left it on the work table, tied with its faded ribbon. She picked it up, carried it back to the shelf under the previous king's notation, Northern Pack Correspondence, Decade 3, slid it into the gap between the two ledgers that flanked it. She stood back and looked at the shelf. 11 letters. A proposal, a refusal, and 9 letters written from a wound that had nothing to do with the wound it claimed. 2 generations of a story that had been wrong before it was ever told to her. She had walked out of a snowstorm, carrying it like it was hers. She left it on the shelf where it belonged. Willa was in the corridor when she came back up the stairwell. "Arm," Willa said by way of greeting. "Fine. I'll be the judge of that. Come to the stores." She turned and walked. "Roderick filed the border record this morning. Your formal status is registered. Healer's assistant, full palace access, secondary notation open per my recommendation." Senna fell into step beside her. "Secondary notation. For whatever comes next." Willa said it without inflection, which was how she said most things that mattered. "The wolf will need work. The first shift is only the beginning. It won't be comfortable, and it will not happen on a schedule you control." "I know. You don't yet." Willa pushed open the door to the healing stores. "But you will." The room smelled of dried bark and wax, and the specific order of a system that had been built by someone who understood both the work and the patience the work required. Senna's corner of the work table was where she had left it. The inventory ledger, open to yesterday's page. A bundle of dried herbs half sorted, waiting. She sat down and picked up where she had stopped. Through the high, narrow window above the work table, the morning was clear and cold and bright. The sky the particular hard blue that only came after weather had moved through and spent itself completely. She had come through a snowstorm with a canvas bag and a knife and a name carrying 30 years of someone else's war. She still had the knife. The name was hers now, clean and uncomplicated, with nothing underneath it but what she had put there herself. She opened the ledger to a new page and began to write.